why this effort was started at the time that it was.
I appreciate that. The effort was actually was requested by both the administration and several city council members who had been separately noting and keeping track of major issues with the zoning code, including the near inability to establish new shelter or community corrections uses. The household definition has long been seen as a boundary or as a barrier to creative and flexible housing. And so a kind of a coalition of city leaders came to CPD back in 2017 and asked us to kind of take a look at what a project like this would look like, what the scope should be, and that's how we got started.
And can you also explain how this and kind of why this has been its own separate process apart from what we did with Blueprint Denver?
Yeah, so I will note that Blueprint Denver acknowledged the need for these things. So it was certainly identified in that process that we had a lot of challenges in zoning for residential care uses. But this is more of a regulatory project. So this is an implementation tool essentially for Blueprint, which most of our text amendments could be considered the same, that we adopt a policy plan and then we seek to implement through text amendments. I do also want to go back to your first question about why we started and highlight one additional factor, and that is that in 2001, a moratorium had been amended on the establishment of new community corrections facilities in the zoning code, and that was due to expire actually, and it did ultimately expire in 2018. And so as that date was coming up, we knew that we also needed to take a look and make sure that the zoning regulations for those types of uses were ready to accept the expiration of that moratorium.
Thank you. I just think it's important to understand kind of what is an implementation tool versus Blueprint Denver kind of being that citywide effort to establish broader policies. And also, as you stated, that this has been going on since 2018. We know that we're in a different time with COVID now, but this is not being done in response to kind of the current circumstance.
It is not, although the current circumstance, certainly with as we look at a potential wave of evictions and job losses, it certainly adds an emergent element to the project.
Thank you.
Okay, let's just take a couple more. Again, we're just looking for clarifications that'll help both us and the public before we go into the public comments. Gosha.
Yes, thank you. Couple quick questions, and I hope that they're just yes or no questions. So the first one, we already talked about it, but I would just want to go on record, ask the question. The city has ability to differentiate between related and unrelated adults in our zoning code.
Yes, so currently as you know, the code does differentiate between related and unrelated adults, and I will note that that's actually a very common approach. The majority of peer cities that we looked at do have some. They typically don't limit related individuals at all, but instead have some limitation on unrelated individuals. And so what we're proposing here would be consistent with how other Front Range cities and other peer cities around the country do this.
Yeah, and the second question is related to it. And I understand that the city actually does not have ability to limit number of related adults, or in other words, limiting the size of family or limiting how many children a person can have.
That's right. So just by way of explanation, there are the Federal Fair Housing Act prohibits any landlords or cities or anybody else from regulating or preventing children to live in households, with just a few exceptions. Senior housing that's specifically funded and built for the purpose of housing senior citizens can exclude children, but otherwise, no cities that we're aware of regulate children specifically.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll end with just a couple. Community corrections, halfway houses, group housing for those who had previously been incarcerated but are no longer incarcerated as kind of a re-entry house. There's a spectrum of these sorts of things. And could you tell us just what are the appropriate names for that spectrum of housing for those that are currently or previously incarcerated, and how does the current zoning regulate those versus the proposal?
So, so currently, those individuals who are not paroled, who are still formally serving their sentence, but who have been placed in a community corrections program to kind of begin reentry with, being given some limited freedom to go to a job, that sort of thing. Those are our community corrections facilities, and they are governed by both our city and state standards and statutes for those formal community corrections uses. And that is the use that is now called community corrections in the zoning code. It's a sub use within residential care. The zoning code does not specifically regulate where people who have been paroled can live, and they can live anywhere, but there are programs out there for people who have been released from incarceration that help them with maintaining sobriety or life skills or employment, that sort of thing. And depending on how they operate, those can be permitted in a number of ways under the current regulations, including what is now called a special care home or transitional housing, or even in some cases, in rare instances, student housing.